Boldwood presents The Little Provence Bookshop, written by Gillian Harvey and read by Lucy Scott. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. It was the same every morning, even Sundays in the high season. At 7 o'clock, the bell tower opposite would ring out, rousing Monique from her bed, and she'd wash, dress, and make her way to the apartment's small cuisine, fill the copper kettle, and switch on the gas. She always took her coffee the same: 2 teaspoons of ground beans, brewed in a pot, poured into a porcelain cup with gold-embossed edges, with 2 cubes of sugar from the tin. As the heat forced flavour from the grounds, she'd breathe deeply, the smell of the coffee awaking her senses before even touching her lips. Once her espresso was made, she'd sit by the window and watch the courtyard, the movement of the morning as familiar to her as the lines in her palm. There was André, opening the door of the patisserie and brushing flour from his apron. Theo, with his 2 baguettes in brown paper, walking quickly back home for breakfast. Madame Lenore, wheeling her bicycle across the cobbles rather than risk riding. By 7:45, the older children would pass, their backs weighed down by enormous bags stuffed with books, their gait loping and reluctant as they made their way to the bus stop. She loved this morning tableau, seeing the people who'd become friends and perhaps even family over the years, seeing them evolve and change, encounter adversity, and learn how to rise above it, or at least bear it. Growing up in Paris, she'd never imagined that small-town life could be as rich. Maman, with her scarlet lips and tailored clothing, had scorned what she called the dying countryside and preferred to be where there was life. Only there was a difference between being amongst life and living. In Paris, they had been surrounded by people, but had remained lonely. Here, she had been able to make a difference, to use her talent to change lives. And what else was it for? She longed to tell her mother she was wrong. But she had not spoken to Maman for more than 30 years. Perhaps she was already dead. The flash of pain was soon subdued by the memory of what her mother had done to her. Some things could be forgiven. Others left deep wounds that never quite closed. Monique stood and brushed her skirt into place, straightened her blouse, walked to the mirror, and adjusted her chignon, then tried to smile. Her mother's face, perhaps also her daughter's face, smiled back at her. She was a single entity, but carried with her the women who had gone before and those who had come after. As she placed her cup in the sink and made her way to the wooden staircase that snaked down onto the shop floor, she reminded herself that this was the day when Adeline would come. Monique could feel things beginning to shift, as if what had once seemed a complete puzzle had moved to make room for a final piece. The air was different, and her life was in flux. She glanced, in passing, at the small jar of earth on the windowsill. Soon, perhaps, she'd untie the knot, remove the cloth from where she'd buried it a few weeks ago. Perhaps. She breathed in the scent of the books as she made her way down, the smell of ink and fresh paper, dust and older volumes, the mingling of past and present. She felt it healing her, knew the books were there as they always had been, waiting to excite, terrify, enlighten or restore whoever would be next to turn their pages. As she crossed the shadowed floor of the bookshop, her skirt brushed softly against her calves. She knew the layout of the shelves, the stands, the tables with their high-stacked popular volumes. That knowledge, and the tiny amount of light allowed by breaches in the wooden shutters, meant there was no need for the electric light. She reached up for the window catch and opened the wooden frame, unfastening the shutters, and at last folding them back. The April sunlight fell into the room, alighting on her face like a theatre spotlight, illuminating her nut-brown skin, her eyes that sparkled like jewels. Her dress turned from a grey to a vibrant yellow. Her gold hoop earrings shone like stars. Her crystal, a moonstone, glowed against the soft skin at her throat. She fingered it briefly. Then she continued to work her way around the windows, as if she were Mother Nature herself, calling time on the drawn-out night and allowing the spring day to finally burst into being. Chapter 1. From the back of the taxi, Adeline stared out at the darkened streets. The houses shrouded by deep shadows, barely pierced by the dull glow of scattered orange street lamps. Lili was curled up, snuggled under her favourite blanket and nestled into her side, her long dark lashes stark against her pale skin. That side of Adeline's body was warm, a little sticky with sweat. The other remained cold. Adeline had not expected to be so late. She had only worn a light jumper. Through the tinted window, she tried to make out the shapes of things, the size of buildings, to imagine what her surroundings would look like once the sun rose. But the stark gleam of the taxi's headlights was edged with a cloak of blackness that restricted her view and simply showed an empty, uneven and expressionless road ahead. She had wanted to arrive in the daytime. Delays at the airport and an interminable wait for first their luggage, then the taxi, had shattered this hope, and now she simply hoped that she would be able to find the cottage, that the key would be in the lockbox as promised, and that the electricity would have been switched on for their arrival. It would be different if she was alone, she thought, lightly rubbing Lili's arm as her child slept. Alone, she could let herself in and simply collapse on a settee or mattress or whatever sparse furniture might be in place. But with Lili only 5 years old, she knew she had to find the right spot, to make sure there were blankets, that her child would be safe and warm. And God forbid she hadn't packed Bunny. The driver was silent. He'd started with platitudes, asking about their holiday, the reasons for their travels, complimenting her on her French. Her responses had disappointed him, she knew, but she was too tired to explain her life to a stranger and had kept her replies monosyllabic at best. In the end, the conversation had petered out. Perhaps he thought her French wasn't as fluent as he'd believed at first. She felt a little rude. But actually it was a blessing in disguise for the driver. If she unloaded all her angst, her reason for being here, her worries, onto him, he'd probably wind up thoroughly depressed. She glimpsed herself occasionally in the blackened glass of the backseat window, a white face hovering against the dark, her shadowed eyes and straight mouth, her forehead creased with worry. Eventually, the taxi bumped to a halt, and she stepped out, a half-woken Lili leaning heavily against her. The driver placed their cases by her feet, and she thanked him, then turned towards the green front door. As promised, the little lockbox was there, and she punched in the code, relieved when it dropped open to reveal a key. She slipped it into the lock and pushed the door open to their new life. It had taken her a while to sink into sleep last night, so when she woke, Lili standing mischievously refreshed and bright-eyed next to her, she felt sluggish and weighed down. But she tried to smile at the indignant little girl at her side. "Morning, precious," she said. "It's dirty!" "What's dirty?" The light which fell through the unshuttered windows revealed a whitewashed room with elegant, if a little dated, furnishings, including the antique bed she'd fallen into, with its starched sheet and silk counterpane, and an ornate wash-basin at the edge of the room with a rusty smudge of age-old water. Spiders had woven webs in the corners, and dust particles, displaced by the new inhabitants, danced and sparkled. Even so, the sudden dislike of dirt was pretty rich coming from a girl who did everything she could to avoid having to clean her teeth each night. "Everything?" Lili said, screwing up her face in a way which meant to show distaste, but that instead made her look even more adorable than usual. Adeline smiled and propped herself up on her elbows. "Well, the house has been empty for a while, that's all," she said. "We can soon clean it. There's some beautiful furniture in here." Lili looked doubtful, but gave a small, brief nod. Unlike her daughter, Adeline had been pleasantly surprised at the house, had worried it might be damp or dingy or uninhabitable in a number of different ways, despite assurances on the phone from the landlady. Yet it was light and, while rudimentary, freshly painted and more than adequate for the two of them. Lili was used to the straight lines, fresh plaster, and the kind of order that comes with a newly decorated house in England. It would take her some time to get used to the exposed stone, the gaping fireplace, the wooden stairs with their worn treads. But Adeline already saw the beauty in all of it. Perhaps she had been right to come. "Come on," she said, suddenly throwing the covers back and swinging her legs around. "Get dressed and we'll get croissants for breakfast." Her daughter's nose screwed up again. "Frosties?" she asked. Adeline laughed. "I'm sure we can get some later, for tomorrow. But we'll have to make do with fresh pastries from the boulangerie for breakfast, I'm afraid." It was tongue-in-cheek, but Lili, used to sugary cereal and cold milk, sighed and nodded her head. "Okay, Mum," she said, resigned. Minutes later, they were crossing the narrow road outside their house in hurriedly pulled-on clothing, standing in the queue outside the boulangerie, behind an elderly man in a blue jacket, who turned and gave them a brief bonjour. Behind the counter, a young man with sandy brown hair and impressive biceps was wrapping a baguette expertly in a sheet of thin brown paper. He wore a white apron over blue jeans and a black t-shirt slightly dusted with flour. As he turned the baguette over with a flourish, his tongue hovered at the side of his mouth. He was almost too good-looking, and Adeline's longing, hungry gaze soon grew tired of pain au chocolat and rested instead on the tasty morsels serving them. "Mummy," said Lili quietly, tugging at Adeline's hand and interrupting her thoughts. "What is it?" she said, looking at the little inquisitive eyes fixed on hers. "Why are you staring at that man?" Adeline felt her neck get hot. Had she been? "I wasn't silly," she said, hoping any Anglophones eavesdropping would hear her denial. "I was looking at the croissants. Don't they look tasty?" There was a slight snort behind her, and she turned, her brow furrowed, to meet the sparkling black eyes of an old lady in a green coat. The woman gave a small shrug and winked, her mouth stretched in a delighted smile. Was she laughing at Adeline? It was true she had been staring at the man behind the counter, but in her defence, he was extremely good-looking. Adeline gave a reciprocal shrug of the shoulders and smiled, hoping that covered all eventualities. The man handed the baguette to the woman at the front of the queue, looking up briefly. His eyes alighted on Adeline, and they exchanged a smile. Adeline had been aware of people watching her and Lili on their way across the courtyard, and now in the queue. Saint-Vien was small, and she'd expected to be noticed. Most people she passed nodded or smiled, although one or two affected not to have seen them at all. The pâtissier had acknowledged her as a stranger, but his smile, albeit brief, had been welcoming. Another woman joined the queue behind them, and soon began talking to the man in front, over the head of Lili and past Adeline, whom she apparently assumed couldn't understand. "It is early in the season for tourists." "Yes, but they come earlier each year. It's good for the businesses." "But not for the town." "Perhaps." Adeline felt her cheeks flush as she realized they were discussing her, and was tempted to say something sharp. Luckily, she was able to hold her tongue. It wouldn't do to get off to a bad start when she'd yet to even meet Monique. "Actually, I'm here to work," she said instead, in perfect French. The conversation stopped, both participants wrong-footed by her understanding of their conversation. Her flawless French spoken with only a hint of a British accent. "Oh, sorry, madame," the man said. "It was rude of us." "No matter," she said, and smiled. He returned her smile and held out his hand. "Patrick Delage." "Adeline Townsend." She gave him her hand for a small shake, then turned to the woman whose face still seemed fixed. "And you are?" "Eva Lenore." The woman nodded, but didn't hold her hand out for a shake. "Nice to meet you," Adeline said, as if Eva's greeting had been perfectly civil. "And where is it you'll be working?" Patrick inquired, La petite librairie, the bookshop. His eyes widened slightly. Oh. He glanced quickly across at Eva, a momentary shadow seeming to cross his face. I see. Oh, and this is Lili, my daughter. Say bonjour, Lili, Adeline added. Lili, who had a rudimentary grasp of French, Adeline had read Choupi and Lili books to her on alternate nights to Peter Rabbit and Peppa Pig, and her daughter had followed the stories fascinated, her young, malleable brain taking in the fricative R's and the absent H's and picking up the language with ease, hid behind her mother's legs and remained silent. When Adeline told people that Lili was bilingual, they'd make remarks like, amazing and wow, and marvel that Adeline, as a single mum, had the time to tutor her. And they were right. It was difficult to fit it all in, to find energy to do all the things she did for Lili. But that was the point, wasn't it? When people are expecting you to fail, you have to work twice as hard to prove that you can rise to the challenge. When her ex-love rat boyfriend, Colin, had balked at the idea of being a father and even suggested an abortion 6 years ago when Adeline had fallen pregnant, she'd known she'd be doing this alone. She'd been warned by so many people how hard it was going to be. But easier to parent single than parent with someone who doesn't care, she'd thought, as she'd released Colin from all his obligations, telling him that she didn't need a penny from him and that as far as she was concerned, he was better off out of the picture. An option he'd taken with great relief. She's shy, Adeline said, but Patrick had already reached the front of the queue and was ordering his pain. Eva nodded once in response and gave a tight smile. Well, nice to meet you. Adeline stroked Lili's hair reassuringly. It was difficult in this unfamiliar place. She shouldn't expect her daughter to suddenly start chatting to strangers in their native tongue. In the end, she selected a pain au raisin and a chocolatine, hoping they'd be more palatable for Lili than croissants. The man gave her the briefest of mercis as she handed over the last of her euros. She'd have to withdraw more cash later. Perhaps there was a bank in the centre, and took the proffered paper bag with its buttery contents back across the road and back through the green door. Inside, she laid 2 plates on the table and split the pastries in half so Lili could taste each one. It was an hour before she had to be at the bookshop, and she felt a flutter of nerves as she sank her teeth into the pain au raisin. But they were good nerves, she decided, because perhaps now she would find her true home. And if not, judging by the delicious treats produced over the road, she could easily drown any sorrows she experienced in butter, chocolate, and flaky pastry. Chapter 2. Holding Lili's cold little hand in hers, Adeline stepped forward and pushed open the glass-checked door, nudging the little brass bell that hung on a spring attached to the frame, tinkling their welcome. The smell of ink on paper was unmistakable, reminding her of libraries, the scent of newsprint as she'd packed newspapers in a bag for her paper round in her early teens, the fragrance of dusty volumes piled high on her desk in the university before she'd left that life behind. There was nobody behind the counter, and for a moment she was glad. It gave her a chance to get her bearings, take a measure of the place. She heard his voice again in her head, saying she was crazy, taking a job in a place she'd never been to. But something about the shop already said home to her. Its shelf-lined walls with books spine out, displaying their titles, the tables stacked with volumes of various genres. It was ramshackle, a mixture of old and new, needed a tidy as well as a dust, but it was a pleasant chaos. Something that spoke of a love of books, a need to overstock the shelves and pile the flat surfaces high, rather than deny any volume its place. She hoped Lili wouldn't remark on the need for a good old-fashioned clean here too. "Cuckoo," she called. "Is anyone here?" Her voice sounded loud on the empty shop floor, but surely if someone was here, they would have heard the bell. Should she have come in at all? Perhaps she'd missed a notice on the door, back in 10 minutes or closed for the morning. But surely Monique was expecting them. Then there was a sound of high heels on wood, and a woman's legs became visible descending the wooden staircase at the back behind the counter. The movement of colourful fabric, the swing of a skirt, a waist, bodice, and finally the whole of her, her slim frame, sun-tarnished skin, hair in a loose chignon. Adeline noticed a pen tucked behind the woman's ear and another in the chignon, and a white blue stone on a golden thread at her neck. The woman turned. "You're here," she said, sounding delighted as she climbed down the final 3 steps onto the shop floor. "I wasn't sure if you would come." It was the first time Adeline had seen Monique, but she recognized the voice from the telephone. She smiled, reached out a hand. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" Monique shrugged playfully. "Not many people from London want to work in Saint-Fiane. I thought you might change your mind." "You'd be surprised," Adeline countered, smiling. "I think many people in London would dream of working in a place like this." "Ah, they dream," Monique said, with a dismissive wave of the hand, "but they do not come. They are too frightened." Her words reminded Adeline of Kevin's words, only his had been said in a derogatory way, trying to dissuade her. "It's the kind of dream that should stay a dream," he'd argued. "People don't actually do things like this." She smiled. "Well, I suppose I am a person who does." She didn't feel brave, though. "Yes, I suppose that you are too," Monique said, clearly amused. "And you must be Lili." She crouched down so she was eye level with the little girl. "It's nice to meet you, Lili." She looked up at Adeline. "Does she understand French? Should I speak in English?" "No, she understands," Adeline said, feeling a swell of pride. "I've always used both languages with her." Adeline tried to move Lili forward, but the little girl remained stubbornly fixed, just behind her legs. "She'll be going to the school tomorrow, I hope." Monique leaned forward, her face playful. "But there is no rush, Adeline. Your Lili will be happy here too, I think. As we discussed, she's welcome in the shop when you are working." Lili's hand tightened in Adeline's, as if to suggest anything but. Straightening and stepping forward, making Lili scuttle even farther behind her mother, Monique passed them, a waft of floral fragrance in her wake, and moved over to a wooden box on wheels filled with picture books. She crouched down, her yellow dress ballooning around her legs, leaving just a sliver of heel visible, and rifled through the content. "Ah," she said, "here." She lifted out a book with a picture of a cat on the front. "For the girl who loves kittens," she said, straightening and holding it out. Adeline felt herself tense as she willed Lili to reach forward and take the book, not to snub Monique's gesture of friendship. But she needn't have worried. Lili dropped her hand and reached slyly for the volume. As soon as she gained purchase, she hugged it to herself, as if frightened Monique might change her mind and take it back. "You can sit," Monique said, gesturing to a small table with chairs in the corner, its surface covered in stumpy wax crayons and discarded paper. "Read, if you want." Lili gave a short, curt nod, a half smile, and made her way over, still clutching the book to her chest. She sank into the chair and began turning the pages, her blonde hair falling slightly over her face as she dipped her head to read. "Thank you," Adeline said. "You're right, she does love kittens." Monique shrugged. "It is nothing. She will be happy for a little while with the book, I think." Adeline nodded. "So," she began, gesturing with her arms. "Yes, so," Monique replied, a smile playing on her lips. "Perhaps we should start." Adeline nodded. In all honesty, she hadn't asked much about what the job would entail when she'd answered the advert. Had expected an interview, a discussion before taking it on rather than just the acceptance she'd received. But she assumed she'd need to be able to operate the till, become familiar with the stock, hopefully learn how to order books for those who couldn't find what they were looking for. Monique would need to train her, but she'd soon get up to speed. "Yes," she said. "Like I mentioned on the phone, I've worked in a shop before, but not for a good few years." And a world away from this place, she thought, remembering the bright, stark shop floor lights, the barcode scanner, and the ill-fitting uniform she'd squeezed into for her Saturday job as a teen. Monique gave another dismissive wave. I think you will find things a bit different here. No doubt, and certainly worlds away from being a teacher, she said, referencing Adeline's most recent job. Adeline laughed. Do you promise? She joked. Monique looked at her askance. Oui, it is sure, she said, all seriousness. Adeline's smile faltered. She nodded. Well, great, she said weakly. Perhaps in France, teachers weren't quite as maligned as they were back home. Whenever she made a chance remark about leaving the profession in London, people would roll their eyes and drop anecdotes about young people today, or remark that they'd never be a teacher, or tell her hilarious stories about the awful things they'd done in their own school days. The more daring of them sometimes commented on the long holidays and be much closer to a knuckle sandwich than they might imagine. Come, I will make us coffee. We should talk, Monique said, gesturing to the stairs. Adeline shot a look at Lili. She will be fine. The bell will tell us if someone comes, and we will be able to hear if she calls. Okay, Adeline replied doubtfully, hoping they wouldn't come back to find half the stock sold to the next customer for a couple of coins or a handful of sweets. Mum is just popping upstairs, she said to her daughter, who nodded her head, eyes still fixed on a picture of a white kitten playing with a ball of wool. Adeline followed her new boss up the wooden stairs into a small corridor and then into a pretty room that opened out to reveal a glossy rosewood table with carved wooden seats, a faded chaise longue stacked with books, an armchair with a floral cover. Light from the large windows streamed across the worn wood of the table's surface, highlighting its uneven patina, brushing the upholstered backs of the chairs with a pinkish light. Espresso? Oh, oui, merci, Adeline said, although she wasn't really a fan of the strong, bitter, and all-too-short beverage. It just felt right to agree. Because I have tea also, Monique called, her voice more distant. Adeline turned and realized she must have slipped from the room to prepare the drinks. There was a laugh in her voice again, as if she realized that Adeline had agreed to espresso out of politeness. No, thank you, Adeline doubled down. Espresso will be lovely. Her eye alighted on a shelf on which there stood a collection of jars filled with coloured powders, perhaps bath salts? But no. Now looking closer, she saw one had a leaf curling around the glass of its interior, another contained a coin resting on a dark powder. Moments later, her host returned with a tray on which sat a large porcelain coffee pot and 2 tiny cups. Little biscuits wrapped in twists of paper garnished the saucers, and she placed a delicate cup in front of Adeline with a smile. I have some juice for your Lili when she wants, she said. Thank you. Adeline lifted the cup to her lips and was surprised by the mild, rich taste. I like your jars, she said, nodding at the shelf. Merci, Monique answered. They are pretty, no? Her eyes searched Adeline's face for a moment, before she looked away and took a sip from her cup. Adeline longed to ask more, but couldn't quite find the words. So I meant to check what my hours will be, and do you use Excel or another program for the accounts? She said instead. To her surprise, Monique laughed throatily, reaching a hand forward to steady herself against the table. I am sorry, she said. It is rude of me. It's just, you are so very British. I am? Yes. Or perhaps I should say, so very metropolitaine, Monique continued. It is not an insult, she added quickly. It is just that we do things very differently in Saint-Vienne. You don't have set hours? No, mon cœur. It is not that. What I mean is that your question is so very practical, and this is not a practical shop. It is a shop that sells stories. Monique swept her arms out wide, as if to indicate the enormity of this task. Stories do not fit neatly into a spreadsheet. They fill the space they need in our hearts, our heads, our imaginations. Yes, of course, we must deal with money and opening hours and all the things like taxes that are necessary. But what is necessary is not always important. When you prepare for a role in my store, the first thing I want to learn about you is the content of your heart. My heart? Yes.
Why do you love books? Why do you choose to come here to work? What makes your heart beat faster? Well, I like books. I guess love them, I mean. This too seemed to amuse Monique. But of course. But what is your passion? Well, I'm here to improve my French. I started a master's years ago and, well, it didn't work out. Adeline felt herself stumble over the words. I did teacher training, though, then taught French. She trailed off. Monique was silent for a moment, studying Adeline's face. Then she nodded as if coming to a decision. Well, this is a start, a purpose. We can talk more in the future. When you are ready, or perhaps when you know yourself a little better. She sipped her espresso. And you can recommend books to people? Oh, yes, of course. I try to read more while I'm here. I'd like to. Adeline wanted to ask Monique what she meant about knowing herself better. Was it a slight, or had she misunderstood Monique's rapid French? Monique leaned towards her, the moonstone swinging on its delicate chain. Yes, this is all good, she said. But what I hope you will learn is not simply to fulfill orders for people or to find, perhaps, the latest crime thriller or a book they must read at school. I hope you will start to find out how to select the right book for customers. She patted her bosom with the flat of her hand. From here, from the heart. Oh, well, I mean, of course I'll try to. No, Monique said firmly. You must not try. You must feel. She looked at Adeline's face, a little mischief in her eyes. I can see that you try, that you want so much for things. It is an effort, yes? But here, I hope you will learn not to try, to force, but to live, to be, to tune in. She tapped a finger against her head to emphasize the point, found one of the tucked-in pens, removed it. Okay? Adeline began to wonder whether she might have made a bit of a mistake. Clearly, she knew the little independent bookshop in an obscure French village wasn't going to operate like Waterstones, but she had thought she would understand what was expected of her. Monique was delighted by her hesitant response. Ah, you are like the others. When I first came here many years ago, they called me a witch, said I was crazy. But they have come to understand that the right book is more than just a tale to entertain, no? The right book can heal us, can speak to us and help us to be well. It can? I mean, yes, I'm sure. Adeline stuttered. They both sipped their coffee, eyeing each other over the porcelain. And they said, Adeline added rather nervously, that you were a witch? She tried to laugh, but the sound that came out was more like a monosyllabic whimper. Why would they think that? Monique's eyes sparkled. People think what they wish. It is their right. Of course, but... Ah, you will see. Monique stood and Adeline followed suit. Some of my methods are perhaps a little unusual, but they work. Maybe some people would call them spiritual, unusual, even strange. She leaned forward a little. And yes, sometimes there is a little magic involved. But eventually people have come to realize that whatever I do, it is good. It comes from a place of love. Because La Petite Librairie, we do not always give our customers what they want, but we always find them what they need. Chapter 3. Dear Eddie, I'm not sure when you'll be able to pick up your emails, but hopefully this will reach you okay. Your mobile phone isn't working. I assume you need to get a French one. Please let me have the new number as soon as you do. We really need to talk. Chris has been asking about you. She was really worried. Well, we all are. I've been thinking about what you said, about needing more from life, about the fact you've never fit in. But don't you think it might just be finding those papers that has made you feel that way? You never seemed unhappy before. I get that you need to find yourself, but do you really think moving to a French backwater is going to do that for you? You need to come home, not for me, but for you. I get it, why you did what you did. You want answers. But Addie, there won't be any answers there. You're in shock, maybe. But the last thing you should be right now is alone. You're grieving. We both are. Just please get on a plane and we'll sort this out together. Kev. Chapter 4. Standing behind the counter, Adeline ran her hands over the worn wood, feeling the grooves left by years of customers and servers, passing goods, taking money. Monique had said that before she'd arrived, the shop had been a clothing store, and Adeline tried to imagine what it might have looked like. But it was impossible. Surrounded by books, almost bathing in their smell, texture, and the colour radiating from their leather, or paper-bound spines, it was impossible to imagine that La Petite Librairie had had a life before Monique. Sometimes, too, only 2 days in, Adeline felt so divorced from her own life back in England that it was hard to picture what London was like without her. Her flat, sublet to a friend of her cousin, her favourite café, missing a regular customer, although, of course, with a constant stream of trade, she wouldn't be missed. Yesterday, she'd gone with Lili to the mairie to register her for school and had been surprised at the ease of the process. A small form to complete, information to provide, a copy of Lili's passport and some health information, and she was told her daughter could start the next day. "Isn't that wonderful?" she'd said to Lili, feeling something inside her crack at the thought of their imminent separation, but displaying only a smile on the outside. It wouldn't help Lili to show she was afraid for her. In the end, she needn't have been, she thought now, looking out over the empty courtyard with its rather forlorn fountain and beyond to the little Café des Sports, where several locals moved beyond the glass. Lili had dropped her hand the minute they'd entered the playground and rushed ahead. Adeline had lingered at the edge of the tarmacked surface, not sure exactly what to do, until a woman in jeans with a wide smile had told her she'd take it from here. It was exactly what she'd hoped. Lili was unafraid, rushing towards the opportunity to lose herself with other youngsters. But it was a bit insulting, too, to be dumped so readily. One tear or a small backward glance would have been nice, she'd thought, shaking her head, amused. The bell tinkling broke her train of thought, and she stretched her lips into a smile as an old woman made her way into the store. "Bonjour, madame." "Bonjour." The woman looked at Adeline with interest, her brown eyes sharp and youthful within the walnut grooves of her face. She was wearing a scarf tied around her head, a little like women had worn in the 50s back in England, and a long navy raincoat. She carried an empty canvas bag, which sported a picture of oranges and apples. Adeline watched as the woman eyed the new releases on one of the front tables. Before making her way to the counter, "You're new?" she said simply. "Yes." The woman nodded. "Madame Dupont," she said. "Monique has a book for me?" "Of course." Monique had given her a list before leaving, with scrawled names of customers who'd made orders in the preceding days. Adeline looked at the paper-wrapped parcels under the counter, each one inscribed in a looping hand. She found one labelled Dupont and picked it up, feeling the weight of the hard-covered volume inside. The woman nodded and slipped the parcel into her bag. "So you are British," she said, more of a statement than a question. "Yes," Adeline replied, hoping that this was something Madame Dupont had learned from Monique, rather than worked out from her ropey accent or very British appearance. It wasn't as if she was wearing Union flag clothing or sporting a bowler hat after all. "And you are here for?" "3 months, maybe more." Another nod, and the ghost of a smile flickered across the woman's face. "So you are Monique's new project?" she said. A project? Perhaps she had misunderstood. The woman barked a laugh. "Don't be offended. Monique likes to fix people, situations. I expect she has plans for you." "Really?" The woman leaned forward conspiratorially. "She has magic about her, Monique. Mark my words, she'll have you married off within the year." She nodded, her eyes scanning Adeline's face, perhaps looking for a flash of pleasure at the idea. "Married? Oh, no, I'm here to improve my French, get to know the country a little." Another laugh. "But you will see. the woman said delightedly. I am sure Monique has more in store for you. I saw her with her pot of earth and knew that someone would be coming. She chuckled again. Tell her I will pay her tomorrow, she added, turning from the counter, the book in the canvas bag knocking lightly against her leg. Was that okay? Monique hadn't mentioned that customers could delay payment, but Adeline didn't feel comfortable asking. Madame Dupont seemed to be familiar with the shop, with Monique, so she simply smiled and nodded, hoping it was the right call. The woman left, and the shop settled into quietness again. It was a peaceful rather than an oppressive hush. Outside she could still hear the growl of an odd passing car, the steps of people out walking, the noise of occasional snatched conversation. She wondered what Madame Dupont had meant by the pot of earth. Perhaps it was better not to know. A man was next, browsing the shelves and refusing any assistance. He disappeared without making a purchase. Then a woman came in with a small child and chose one of the books from the wooden box of children's titles. She paid her 10 euros and said something about the weather. Her child, a boy of about 3 years, looked at Adeline with interest, his eyes brown pools of wonder. Perhaps it was rare to see new people in the village. Don't stare, Louis, his mother admonished him. Adeline smiled at him as he peeped at her from behind his mother. When the woman wasn't looking, she made a silly face and saw pleasure spread across his features at their shared joke. When she'd first seen the shop, Adeline had worried a little that it might be a bit too quiet, a bit too tucked away. What would they do all day if just 1 or 2 customers came in? But La Petite Librairie seemed to have a steady stream of visitors. An older woman asked for Monique, but wouldn't accept help from Adeline, saying it was personal. I do know about books, Adeline found herself crying after her. But the woman raised a hand dismissively and continued her walk across the cobbled courtyard. It was bound to be difficult at first, Adeline reasoned. People had known Monique and her shop for years. They weren't expecting someone new. All the same, she hoped it wasn't her accent, her otherness that was putting them off. Before she could think further, an older man entered the shop. He was dressed in a long brown coat which hung misshapenly around his frame, and corduroy trousers in a khaki green, ending in a pair of slightly battered leather shoes. He stopped when he saw her rather than Monique behind the counter, and Adeline prepared herself for another snub. Instead, he doffed an imaginary cap and wished her a good morning. Good morning, she replied, smiling. I'm Adeline, Monique's new assistant. He nodded, his blue, slightly watery eyes taking her in. Welcome, he said at last. Thank you. Can I help you? Perhaps. A silence settled around them. What can I do for you? She asked, slightly confused. Maybe a book? She flushed. Of course, but, what sort of book are you looking for? I think, Madame, he replied. The question should be, what book is waiting for me? Her eyes scanned the beige-wrapped packaging. Have you ordered something? He laughed softly. Once. No matter, he said. It will arrive when it arrives, no? But your name? Claude, he said simply. He was right, she realized. None of the packages read Claude. I'm sorry, she said. Monique will be back soon. Tell her I will come again tomorrow. Tell her that Claude still has the heaviness. Oh, yes, of course. She jotted it on the little notebook kept on the counter for that purpose. Claude, heaviness. The man nodded kindly, then turned towards the door. As he lifted his hand towards the handle, he asked, But for you, did you find what you are looking for yet? Oh, no, she said quickly. I work here. I'm just serving. He shook his head almost fondly. But you are looking, too, for something. We all are, he said. Sometimes we don't even know it. That's what I learned from Monique over the years, and perhaps you will learn, too. It was such a strange thing to say that she ended up simply smiling and nodding as if she understood. The shop bell tinkled his departure, and she felt quite relieved,
inspecting the packages once more for his name, but finding it absent. There was something quite unsettling about the encounter, but by the time Monique returned from her errands, she'd served 2 further locals, quite pleased with herself that she'd been able to recommend a book she recognised in the new releases pile, and more or less forgotten about it. Her language, although perhaps a little rusty, had held up well, and she'd begun to feel more at home already. "Rebonjour," her new boss said, breezing in with a basket of fruit. "Everything all right?"
"Yes, fine, thank you."
She told Monique about Madame Dupont and the book she'd taken. Monique nodded. "So all was good?"
"Well, yes, except—"
"Except?" Monique raised an amused eyebrow. "Something has happened?"
"Not exactly, just... It's a little odd, but a couple of people have suggested that you have plans to marry me off or fix me in some way," she said, half laughing, half serious. "I'm guessing it's a joke of some sort." Monique laughed, throwing her head back with abandon. She set the basket down on the counter. The bright clementines and oranges smelt fresh and sweet. Suddenly Adeline remembered she hadn't eaten breakfast.
"They say this?" Monique asked, amused. Adeline nodded. "Well, yes, I mean, sometimes I have introduced people if I feel, that they will get along. Perhaps they mean this. But it is rare, don't worry." She chuckled affectionately, shaking her head at the idea. "Well," said Adeline, finding herself smiling, "I tell you what, if Mr. Wright walks in through the door, I'll let you know." At that exact moment, André from the patisserie, this time without his apron or flour dust, pushed open the door, and Monique gave her a pointed eyebrow raise. "You have to pluck the apple from the tree while it is ripe," she said, tipping her head slightly in André's direction. Flushing, Adeline turned and busied herself with a pile of books that she'd already sorted, hoping Monique would deal with whatever he wanted and she could hide her embarrassment. She'd have to be made of stone not to notice how gorgeous André was. But after Colin, she'd learned that whatever the exterior, it was better not to come to rely on a man, better to look from afar but keep herself safe. Moments later, they were alone again. "Do not worry," Monique said. "People like to talk, but I will tell my friend Cupid to fly off to somewhere else." Adeline grinned. "Thank you." She almost added that she'd make an exception for André if Cupid asked very nicely, but wasn't sure if Monique would get the joke. Instead, she moved the conversation on. "Oh, and a man, Claude, came in. He seemed to be looking for something, but..." She shrugged. "He said to tell you he'd be in tomorrow."